The autumn of 1859 painted Havenwood Hollow in strokes of breathtaking melancholy. The sugar maples that lined the single dirt road bled crimson and gold against a sky the color of washed-out slate. A perpetual dampness clung to the air, carrying the scent of wood smoke, decaying leaves, and a quiet, unspoken dread that had become as much a part of the village as the old stone church. In a small cottage at the edge of the woods, where the village's carefully maintained order began to fray into wilderness, Elara Vance moved with a practiced economy of motion. At 42, her face was a roadmap of her life's joys, and more deeply, its sorrows. Her hair, once the color of dark honey, was threaded with silver at the temples, usually tucked neatly under a simple bonnet. Her hands, however, told the truest story. They were not the soft, delicate hands of a town lady, but the instruments of a craft. Calloused from gripping, yet nimble from decades of guiding new life into the world, they were currently sorting through a basket of dried chamomile and lavender. The herb's calming scent was a stark contrast to the tension coiled in her shoulders. Elara was a widow. Her husband, John, a man with a laugh as warm as a summer sun, had been taken by pneumonia 7 winters ago. Their own child, a daughter named Lily, had followed him 2 years later, succumbing to a fever that had swept through the valley, stealing her away before she'd seen her 3rd birthday. The silence in her cottage was a physical presence, a constant companion. Yet, it was not her own grief that weighed on her most heavily these days. It was the grief of others, a grief she was inextricably, terrifyingly linked to. For 12 years, a shadow had lengthened over Havenwood Hollow. It began subtly, a tragedy here, a heartbreak there, as is the way of life. But soon, a pattern emerged, too consistent to be mere misfortune, too cruel to be the work of God. The babies were dying. They would be born pink and wailing, a picture of health, only to wither away within months. A cough would turn into a rattling in the chest. A rosy cheek would become pale and listless. Before their 2nd birthday, without fail, they were gone. 77 times this had happened. 77 tiny headstones dotted the newer section of the churchyard, a silent, damning testament to the village's curse. And Elara Vance had delivered every single one of them. The sharp, frantic rap on her door cut through the quiet. Elara didn't startle. She had been expecting it. She wiped her hands on her apron and opened the door to see Thomas Miller, his face pale and beaded with sweat despite the autumn chill. He was a young farmer, strong and capable, but at this moment, he looked like a frightened boy. "Mrs. Vance," he gasped, his chest heaving. "It's time. Sarah, the baby is coming." "Breathe, Thomas," Elara said, her voice a low, steady anchor in his storm of panic. "All will be well. Let me get my bag." Her birthing bag was always ready. Clean linens, carbolic soap, a new and expensive oddity she insisted upon, herbal tinctures for pain and to staunch bleeding, and the tools of her trade, boiled and wrapped. As she stepped out into the dying light, she could feel the change in the air. The walk to the Miller's farmhouse on the opposite side of the village was a gauntlet of silent judgment. Windows that were usually open to the evening air were shuttered as she passed. Mrs. Gable, sweeping her porch, stopped abruptly and hurried inside, the slam of her door echoing down the lane. A group of men talking near the blacksmith's forge fell silent, their eyes following her with a mixture of hope and accusation. They needed her. They feared her. She heard a whisper, carried on the wind from a nearby cottage, sharp as a shard of glass. "The Vance woman, pray for them." Elara kept her chin high, her gaze fixed forward, but the words pricked at her like thorns. She remembered a time when her passage through the village was met with warm smiles and grateful nods. She had been a symbol of life, of hope. Now she was an omen. Inside the Miller's small, tidy home, the air was thick with anticipation. A fire roared in the hearth, boiling a large kettle of water. Sarah Miller lay in bed, her face contorted in a wave of pain. She was barely 20, her eyes wide with the primal fear of a first-time mother, compounded by the village's grim history. "Elara," she breathed, reaching out a trembling hand as Elara set down her bag. "I'm so scared. And that is perfectly natural. Alara said, taking Sarah's hand in her own. Her touch was firm, grounding. But you are strong, and your body knows what to do. I am here to help. We will do this together. For the next several hours, Alara was a master of her craft. She was a calming presence in the storm of childbirth, her instructions clear and encouraging, her touch gentle but firm. She moved about the lamplit room, checking Sarah's progress, offering sips of water, and murmuring words of comfort. She pushed aside the whispers, the 77 tiny ghosts that stood at the edge of her consciousness, and focused entirely on the life struggling to be born. Finally, with a gut-wrenching cry from Sarah and a final, heroic push, the baby arrived. A wave of silence fell over the room, thick and anxious, broken only by the crackling fire. Then, a sputtering cough, followed by a loud, lusty wail that filled every corner of the small house. It was the most beautiful sound in the world. "You have a son, Sarah," Alara announced, her voice thick with emotion as she expertly cleared the infant's airways. A strong, healthy son. Tears of relief streamed down Thomas's face as he knelt by the bed, kissing his wife's forehead. Sarah, exhausted but radiant, sobbed with a joy so pure it seemed to momentarily banish the shadow from the room. Alara cleaned the baby, wrapped him in a warm blanket, and placed him in his mother's waiting arms. She watched them for a moment, a perfect portrait of a new family, bathed in the golden light of the lamp. Hope, fierce and fragile, was alive in that room. But as Alara packed her bag to leave, she saw it. Beneath the joy in Thomas and Sarah's eyes, the fear hadn't vanished. It was merely hiding, waiting. It was the fear she saw in all the parents' eyes. Her walk home was a solitary one, the chill of the night seeping deep into her bones. She entered her cottage, the silence rushing back in to greet her. After stoking the embers in her own hearth, she didn't go to bed. Instead, she walked to the simple wooden mantelpiece above the fireplace. Her fingers, which had just welcomed a new life, trembled slightly as they hovered over a small, locked wooden box. It held no herbs or tools of her trade. It held her own meticulous records, her own desperate search for an answer. 77 entries. Tonight, she would have to prepare a new page for baby boy Miller, born healthy, crying strongly, just like all the others. The first month of Samuel Miller's life was a fragile, sun-drenched bubble of joy in the grim landscape of Havenwood Hollow. Autumn held its breath, gracing the valley with an extended Indian summer. In their small, sturdy cottage, Sarah and Thomas existed within that bubble, their world shrinking to the dimensions of a wooden cradle. Every coo was a symphony, every tiny fist wrapped around a finger was a miracle. They named him Samuel, a name that felt solid and biblical, a shield against the creeping dread of the village. Alara visited weekly, her footsteps on the gravel path a recurring intrusion of reality. She'd bring balms for Sarah and check on the baby with a professional gentleness that was both reassuring and terrifying. She'd weigh him on a small brass scale, her face unreadable as she noted the steady increase. "He's strong," she'd say, her voice low and even. "His lungs are clear." Sarah would watch her, a hawk guarding its nestling, her gratitude warring with a primal suspicion she couldn't shake. Thomas was more distant, his gratitude expressed in clipped sentences and a refusal to meet Alara's eyes. He would stand by the hearth, ostensibly sharpening a tool or mending a strap, but his entire being was focused on the interaction between the midwife and his son. They were trapped between needing Alara's expertise and fearing the curse that clung to her like a shroud. The other children, they seemed strong at first too. Sarah asked one afternoon, her voice barely a whisper as she swaddled Samuel in a fresh linen. The question hung in the air, sharp as glass. Alara paused, her hand hovering over a jar of calendula salve. She chose her words with the care of someone navigating a minefield. "Every child is different, Sarah. Hope is not a foolish thing. Hold on to it." But her eyes held the ghost of 78 other cradles, and Sarah saw it, turning away to hide the fresh spike of fear. As October bled into a damp, chilly November, the village's collective anxiety began to curdle. The whispers that had followed Alara down the main street grew louder, more pointed. They were no longer murmurs of pity, but budding accusations. The arrival of Reverend Blackwood for his pastoral visits only fanned the embers. He was a tall, gaunt man with eyes that seemed to absorb all the light in a room. His faith was a rigid, unforgiving thing, built on a foundation of sin and retribution. "The Lord gives, and the Lord takes away," he would intone, placing a hand on Samuel's head. But his prayers felt less like a blessing and more like a warning. He spoke of unseen taints and spiritual sickness, his gaze often drifting to the small pouch of dried herbs Alara had left on the mantelpiece. "There are worldly cures and there are matters of the soul," he told Thomas one evening. "One must be wary of where they place their faith." Then it started. A small, wet cough, insignificant at first. Thomas dismissed it as a draft from the window. Sarah convinced herself it was a speck of dust in the air, but it didn't go away. It settled deep in Samuel's tiny chest, a persistent, rattling sound that filled the silences in the cottage. Alara came as soon as she was called, the wind whipping her cloak around her legs. The air was cold now, carrying the metallic scent of impending snow. She examined Samuel, her expression tight with concentration. His skin was warm, his breathing slightly labored. "It's a chest cold," she said, trying to keep her voice steady. "Common enough. We need to keep him warm and help him breathe." She prepared a steam bowl with eucalyptus and thyme, the sharp, medicinal scent filling the room. She showed Sarah how to make a poultice of mustard and flour to place on his chest. "He's fighting. He has a strong will." But the fight was a losing one. Over the next 2 weeks, the cough worsened. A fever set in, a stubborn heat that her tinctures of willow bark and elderflower could not break. The healthy weight he had gained began to melt away. His cries, once robust, became thin and reedy, a sound that tore at Sarah's soul. The joyful bubble had burst, and the cold reality of Havenwood Hollow rushed in. Paranoia became the new master of the Miller house. Every creak of the floorboards was a harbinger of doom. Every shadow in the corner was a lurking threat. Thomas and Sarah stopped sleeping, their faces gaunt, their eyes wide with a terror that was becoming agonizingly familiar to the village. Reverend Blackwood became a more frequent visitor. He no longer spoke in veiled suggestions. "This is not a common sickness," he declared, his voice ringing with grim authority as he stood over the cradle. "This is a blight, an affliction visited upon us. We must ask ourselves what unnatural presence has been invited into this home." His eyes settled on Alara's remedies, then on Sarah, who was weeping silently into her hands. One evening, Alara arrived to find the door barred. She knocked, calling out Thomas's name. After a long moment, he opened it just a crack. His face was a mask of grief and anger. "We don't need you anymore," he said, his voice rough. "Thomas, he needs care. The fever. Reverend Blackwood is with us now. We are putting our faith in God, not in your methods." The accusation was clear. "Your curse, your shadow. Let me just see him," Alara pleaded, her own heart cracking. She could hear the baby's labored breathing from the doorway. From inside, Sarah's voice, shredded with despair, cried out, "Go away, just go away. You've done enough." The door shut in her face. The heavy thud of the bolt sliding into place was a sound of absolute finality. Alara stood on the doorstep, the cold seeping into her bones, the weight of the 79th tragedy already beginning to settle upon her. She looked up at the darkening sky, where the first flakes of snow were beginning to fall, each one a tiny white shroud drifting down upon the cursed, hopeless village. The silence in Alara's cottage was a physical weight. For 3 days, it had been her only companion, pressing in on her from the low, beamed ceiling and the cool stone hearth. The familiar scents of dried lavender and chamomile, usually a comfort, now seemed to mock her, reminders of remedies that had failed. Outside, the sounds of Havenwood Hollow were muted, as if the village itself were holding its breath. But Alara knew it was simply that no one came near her door anymore. No child's laughter drifted from the lane, no neighbor called out a greeting. She was an island, surrounded by a sea of silent condemnation. She spent the hours cleaning tools that were already immaculate, rereading passages in her medical texts that she knew by heart. It was a desperate attempt to impose order on a world that had spiraled into chaos, to cling to the logic of science when all around her were succumbing to superstition. Each creak of her floorboards sounded like an accusation. Every shadow in the corner of her eye looked like a specter of one of the 78 children she had brought into the world, only to lose. She thought constantly of little Samuel, his tiny chest struggling for air, the rattling sound of his cough. She replayed her last moments in the Miller home, the raw grief in Sarah's eyes turning to a hard, bitter resentment. Thomas's face, once open and friendly, had become a mask of fear and blame, his hand protectively on the Reverend's arm as he'd shown her the door. The memory was a fresh wound, and it throbbed with a pain as sharp as any physical ailment. On the morning of the fourth day, the sound she had been dreading finally came. It wasn't a knock on the door or a shouted message. It was the slow, solemn tolling of the church bell. 1, 2, 3, each peal was a hammer blow against her heart. She didn't need to count. She knew the sequence. It was the bell for the passing of a child. Samuel was gone. The fragile, flickering hope that had briefly warmed Havenwood Hollow had been extinguished, and in its place, the cold darkness of grief and suspicion returned, deeper than ever before. Elara sank into a wooden chair, her body trembling. A dry, ragged sob escaped her lips, but no tears came. There were no tears left. There was only a vast, hollow emptiness where her hope had been. 79. The number echoed in the crushing silence of her home. 79 souls she had welcomed, 79 futures that had vanished into dust. The day of the funeral was cold and gray, a low ceiling of clouds threatening a chilling autumn rain. Elara watched from the window of her cottage, which overlooked the path leading to the village cemetery. She saw the procession, a small, dark ribbon of humanity moving against the muted landscape. Thomas and Sarah Miller walked at the front, their bodies bent as if against a harsh wind, their faces aged by a grief too profound for their years. Reverend Blackwood walked beside them, his posture rigid and righteous, his hand resting on Thomas's shoulder in a gesture that was both comforting and possessive. The rest of the village followed, a somber crowd, their gazes fixed forward, deliberately avoiding even a glance toward Elara's home. She would not attend. Her presence would be a profanity, a cruel intrusion on their sorrow. But she had to bear witness. From her vantage point, she watched them gather around a fresh plot of earth on the far side of the cemetery, a small mound in a long, heartbreaking row of similar mounds. She saw the Reverend raise his hands, his voice a low murmur she couldn't hear but could feel in the marrow of her bones. She imagined his words, words of fire and brimstone, of divine punishment and unnamed sins, words that would weave Samuel's death into the tapestry of fear he had so expertly crafted. And as the sermon concluded and the first handful of dirt was thrown onto the tiny coffin, she saw several heads turn, their eyes, even from this distance, finding her window. They were not looks of shared sorrow, but of cold, hard certainty. They had found the source of their curse. It was her. When the last villager had departed and the gravedigger was left to his lonely work, Elara finally turned from the window. The dam of her composure broke. She collapsed against the rough-hewn table, the sobs she had suppressed tearing through her with convulsive force. It was a storm of grief, for Samuel, for all the others, for the parents left shattered, and for herself, for the life of service and healing that had been twisted into a mark of damnation. She wept until she was empty, until the grief subsided into a cold, simmering rage. An injustice had been done, not just to her, but to reason itself. These were not the acts of a vengeful God or a whispered curse. Reverend Blackwood spoke of a spiritual malaise, but Elara had seen the physical symptoms. The fever, the cough, the wasting away, it was a sickness. It was tangible medical. It had a cause. And if it had a cause, it could be understood. It could be fought. Slowly, she pushed herself up from the table. Her eyes, red and swollen, scanned her small cottage. They fell upon a large, locked cedar chest that sat at the foot of her bed. It didn't hold linens or keepsakes. It held her life's work. Her resolve hardened, crystallizing out of the raw pain. They had cast her out. They had named her the problem. Very well, she would be the one to find the solution. With determined steps, she crossed the room and retrieved a small iron key from a hook near the hearth. The lock on the chest clicked open with a sound that seemed unnaturally loud in the quiet room. She lifted the heavy lid. Inside, stacked neatly, were 10 thick, leather-bound journals, her records. She pulled out the most recent volume and carried it to the table. Lighting a fresh candle against the encroaching twilight, she dipped her pen in ink. Her hand was steady now. She opened to a new page, dated it, and wrote a title. Samuel Miller, born August 12, 1859. She meticulously documented everything she knew from her visits. His initial healthy weight, his clear lungs at birth, the date she first noticed the faint cough, the progression of the fever, the remedies administered, and their lack of effect. She concluded the entry with a final, stark sentence. Died October 28, 1859. Age, 11 weeks. Closing the book, she took a deep breath. This was not an ending. It was a beginning. She pulled the other journals from the chest, piling them on the table. Each one contained the stories of the lost children, recorded with the same dispassionate, scientific detail. Birth weights, maternal health, the sequence of symptoms, the weather, the season. 12 years of tragedy, chronicled in her own hand. Somewhere in these pages, buried beneath the grief and the ink, was a pattern, a clue, a truth that had nothing to do with faith or fear. Elara Vance, the outcast midwife, leaned over the first journal, the candlelight flickering across her face, illuminating not a pariah, but an investigator. Her hunt had begun. The small parlor of Elara's cottage transformed into the nerve center of an unprecedented investigation. The scent of dust, old paper, and drying ink hung thick in the air, a stark contrast to the cloying sweetness of the herbs that usually defined her space. By the light of 2 flickering whale oil lamps, she worked with a feverish intensity that pushed aside grief and exhaustion. The heavy chest of journals sat open like a wound, its contents spilled across her floor and dining table. 79 lives, 79 tragedies, reduced to names, dates, and symptoms in her precise, looping script. For the first 2 days, she did nothing but read, immersing herself in the painful memories. Each entry was a ghost. June 4, 1847. Delivered a boy, Peter, to Martha and James Albright. Strong lungs, fair coloring. A later entry, months after, October 19, 1847. Called to the Albright home. Peter is listless, feverish, a dry, rasping cough. Prepared a poultice of mustard and a syrup of horehound. And the final, gut-wrenching note, October 23, 1847. Peter passed in the night. The bell tolls for another of my babes. One after another, she relived them all. The details were agonizingly similar. A period of robust health followed by the insidious onset of fever, lethargy, and a persistent, dry cough that rattled in their tiny chests until it stole their last breath. The sameness of it was a drumbeat of failure she had internalized for 12 long years. But now, she refused to hear it as a curse. It was a clue. Her scientific mind, the part of her that measured dosages and cataloged herbs, took control. She procured a large sheet of butcher's paper from her pantry, and with a piece of charcoal, began to draw a map of Havenwood Hollow from memory. She marked the church, the general store, Reverend Blackwood's stern-looking manse, and her own small cottage on the edge of the woods. Then, painstakingly, she began to place the families. She took a small pot of watered-down berry juice and, using the tip of a quill, marked a tiny red dot for each home that had lost a child. The Albright house, the Schmidt farmstead, the O'Connell residence near the tannery, the Miller's new home. Dot after red dot populated the paper. When she was finished, she leaned back in her chair, her eyes tracing the crimson constellation of sorrow she had created. For a long moment, she saw no pattern, only a widespread plague of grief that seemed to have infected the very soil of the town. Despair pricked at her, a familiar old friend. Perhaps the Reverend was right. Perhaps it was a blight on their souls. She shook her head, angry at the thought. "No," she whispered to the empty room, her voice hoarse. "There is always a reason." She pushed the map aside and started a new set of charts. She listed each child's name, date of birth, date of death, and age in months. She added columns for the season, the weather, the parents' occupations. She worked through the night, the lamps burning low, her fingers stained with ink and charcoal. The sun rose, casting a pale, gray light into the cluttered room, and she barely noticed. She was a woman possessed by a single, desperate question. Why? The seasons yielded nothing. Babies died in the frozen stillness of winter and the oppressive heat of summer. Occupations were too varied: farmers, a blacksmith, a tanner, a cooper. There was no single thread of lineage connecting them all. Frustrated, she pushed the charts away and stared again at her hand-drawn map. Her eyes, blurry with fatigue, scanned the layout of the village, the scattershot of red dots. And then she saw it. It wasn't a perfect, undeniable cluster, but it was there, a subtle concentration that made the hairs on her arms stand up. The majority of the red dots were gathered in the lower part of the village, the homes that followed the gentle downward slope of the land toward Hollow Creek. The miller's house was there, the Albrights' old place, the Schmidts, the families living on the higher ground, up the rise toward the old woods, were largely untouched. Her heart began to beat faster. It was a whisper of a pattern, not a shout, but it was the first tangible thing she'd had to hold onto in 12 years. What did the homes in the lower village have in common? They were closer to the creek. Hollow Creek, which flowed down from the hills, bisecting the town before meandering out into the wider valley. It was the source of life for the village. It powered the grist mill, watered the livestock, and for many, it was their source of drinking water. She remembered conversations from her visits. Many of the families on the lower road, those without the means or the land for a deep dug well, would simply walk the short distance to the creek with their buckets. They used it for cooking, for washing, for drinking. Her own cottage was situated uphill, and she had a deep, stone-lined well her husband, Thomas, had dug years ago. Clean, cold water, drawn from deep within the earth. Could it be the water? It seemed too simple, and yet it fit. A contamination of some kind, invisible, tasteless, that was most potent in the main waterway. Something that didn't affect adults with their stronger constitutions, but was fatal to the delicate systems of infants. The symptoms, the fever, the respiratory distress, could they be caused by something they were drinking? It would explain the lack of a seasonal pattern and why it struck families of all backgrounds, their only commonality being their geography. But it was just a theory, a fragile hypothesis built on a hand-drawn map and a widow's desperate hope. Her journals, for all their detail on symptoms and remedies, held no information about household water sources. She hadn't thought to ask. It had never seemed relevant. Now, it was the only thing that mattered. She knew what she had to do, and the thought filled her with a cold dread that had nothing to do with ghosts or curses. She had to leave her sanctuary. She had to walk through the streets of Havenwood Hollow, not as a midwife, a healer, or even a pariah. She had to become a spy in her own town. She needed to observe, to confirm which families used wells and which used the creek. She needed data that existed outside the leather-bound volumes on her table. Putting on her plainest woolen shawl and tucking a small, discreet notebook into her pocket, Alara stood at her front door. Her hand trembled as she reached for the latch. Through the small window, she could see the muddy track of the road and the spire of the church in the distance. Out there were the whispers, the accusing glares, the fear she could almost taste. For weeks she had hidden from it, but her scientific resolve now outweighed her personal pain. She was no longer just mourning the dead. She was fighting for the living and for the children yet to be born. Taking a deep breath, Alara Vance opened the door and stepped out into the cold, judgmental light of day. The morning air was sharp and cold, carrying the damp scent of moss and wet earth from the surrounding woods. For weeks, Alara had only breathed the recycled air of her cottage, thick with the smell of old paper, dried herbs, and her own solitary existence. Stepping outside felt like a resurrection into a world that wished she had remained buried. She clutched a worn wicker basket, a simple prop for the role she was about to play. A woman running errands, not a scientist hunting for a silent killer. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic drumbeat against the village's funereal quiet. The path down into the main thoroughfare of Havenwood Hollow was agonizingly familiar. Every stone, every gnarled root was a memory. Here was the bend where she had once helped a young Mrs. Gable, whose toddler had taken a tumble. Now, Mrs. Gable's second child was also in the churchyard, and Alara was the one she blamed. As she drew closer, the village revealed itself not as the home she had once known, but as a hostile territory. Windows that were once open to the morning sun were shuttered tight. A woman sweeping her porch froze, her broom held midair, before turning her back with a deliberate, sharp movement. The silence wasn't empty. It was filled with unspoken accusations that pricked at Alara's skin. Her first destination was Finley's General Store, the hub of village life, and, she hoped, a place where her presence might seem most plausible. The bell above the door chimed with a startling loudness, announcing her arrival to the few patrons inside. A hush fell. Conversation ceased. Arthur Finley, a stout man with a pragmatic face and hands permanently dusted with flour, looked up from behind the counter. His expression was unreadable, a careful neutrality that set him apart from the overt hostility of the others. He neither smiled nor scowled, simply waiting. "Good morning, Arthur," Alara said, her voice steadier than she felt. "I need some flour and salt." "Alara," he acknowledged with a curt nod, turning to scoop flour into a brown paper sack. He didn't ask where she had been. He didn't comment on her drawn appearance. He simply conducted his business, a transaction that felt both blessedly normal and chillingly impersonal. As he weighed the salt, two women who had been examining a bolt of calico pointedly moved to the far side of the store, their whispers like the rustling of dry leaves. Alara's eyes, however, were not on them. They were cataloging, observing. She noted that one of the whispering women, Mrs. Albright, lived in a cottage on the high road, far from Hollow Creek. Alara recalled from her notes that Mrs. Albright had 3 boisterous children, all over the age of 5. Her purchase today included sweets for them. The other woman was newly married, her home just being built on the same elevated ground. Alara committed their faces and their location to memory. Paying Arthur the exact coin, she met his gaze for a brief second. There was no pity there, but perhaps a flicker of something else, a weariness with the whole grim affair. "Thank you, Arthur," she murmured, and left as quickly as she had entered. Now came the most dangerous part of her plan. Instead of taking the direct route home, she turned towards the lower part of the village, her path deliberately meandering along the lane that ran parallel to Hollow Creek. Her basket gave her purpose, a shield against suspicious stares. She walked with her gaze lowered, but her senses were on high alert. To her right, the creek gurgled, its water looking clear and inviting as it tumbled over smooth stones. To her left were the homes of the afflicted. The Miller house, its windows like vacant eyes, sent a pang of grief through her, so sharp it almost buckled her knees. A well-worn path was trodden into the earth between their back door and the creek bank. There was no wellhead, no winch, no bucket sitting on a stone wall. They drew their water directly from the stream. Next door was the Gables' home. The same pattern, a path to the creek. Then the Petersons, who had lost twins 3 years ago, another path. It was all there, just as she had suspected. The evidence was as plain as the dirt paths leading to the water's edge. Her hypothesis hardened into near certainty. She risked a glance up the hill, towards the homes on higher ground. She could see the distinct stone structure of a well in the Albrights' yard, and another in their neighbors'. The map in her mind was filling in, the lines of demarcation stark and clear. So consumed was she by her observations that she didn't notice the figure until it was almost upon her. "What do you think you're doing here?" The voice was raw with pain and fury. It was Martha Gable. Her face, once soft and round, was now gaunt and angular with grief. She stood in the middle of the lane, blocking Alara's path, her hands clenched into fists at her sides. "Martha," Alara began, her throat suddenly dry, "I was just on my way home from the store." "The store?" Mrs. Gable scoffed, her voice rising. "The store is that way. You're snooping, prowling around our homes. Are you looking for your next one? Is that it? Have you not taken enough from us?" The accusation, spoken aloud, was like a physical blow. A door creaked open nearby. A face appeared in a window. The confrontation was drawing an audience. "No," Alara said, her voice shaking but firm. "That's not true. I am trying to understand." "Understand?" Martha shrieked, taking a step closer. Her eyes were wild with a pain Alara knew all too well. "We understand. Reverend Blackwood told us. You brought a curse on this village. You and your unnatural ways. You touch them and they die. My boy, my sweet William, he was fine until you..." She choked on a sob, her anger momentarily collapsing into pure anguish. The sight of her pain cut through Alara's fear. "Martha, I only ever tried to help. I grieve for William. I grieve for all of them." "Liar!" Another voice called out from a nearby doorway. It was Thomas Miller, his face a mask of hollowed-out despair. "Get away from our homes, witch." The word hung in the air, venomous and final. The small crowd was growing, their expressions hardening from suspicion to menace. Alara felt trapped, the creak behind her and a wall of hatred in front of her. Just as a man began to step forward from the small crowd, a calm, authoritative voice cut through the tension. "That's enough." All heads turned. Arthur Finley stood at the end of the lane, a heavy sack of grain over his shoulder. He set it down with a thud. "She bought flour and salt," he said, his voice flat and devoid of emotion, yet it commanded attention. "She's walking home. This is a public lane. Go back to your sorrows, Martha. Harassing her won't bring William back." His words were not a defense of Alara, but a simple statement of fact, an appeal to order. Coming from him, a man respected for his practicality, it had an effect. The anger in the crowd didn't vanish, but it faltered. Mrs. Gable stared at Arthur, then back at Alara, her face contorted with a mixture of rage and confusion. Finally, with a gut-wrenching sob, she turned and fled back into her house. Thomas Miller gave Alara one last glare of pure loathing before retreating into his own home. The others slowly, reluctantly, dispersed. Alara was left standing alone in the lane, her heart pounding. She looked at Arthur. He simply hoisted his sack back onto his shoulder. "Go on home, Alara," he said, his back already to her. It was a dismissal, not an offer of friendship, but it had been an intervention nonetheless. Without a second thought, she turned and fled, not looking back until the safety of her own front door was within reach. Inside, she bolted the door and leaned against it, her body trembling uncontrollably. The basket fell from her numb fingers, spilling the flour across the floorboards. But through the terror, a fierce, burning clarity emerged. She stumbled to her table, grabbed her quill, and with a shaking hand began to mark the map. A circle for a well, an X for creek access. The pattern was no longer a theory. It was a stark, terrible, and undeniable truth written across the geography of Havenwood Hollow. The map, spread across her small dining table, was no longer a comfort. It was an accusation. For 2 days since her venture into the village, Alara had stared at it, the cluster of red marks over the lower village a stark, undeniable truth to her, but meaningless hearsay to anyone else. Observations were not proof. A mother's grief-stricken cry for justice still echoed in her ears, a reminder that logic had no place in a heart shattered by loss. To convince Havenwood Hollow, she needed more than a pattern. She needed a source, an irrefutable, physical cause for the contamination she was now certain existed in Hollow Creek. The late autumn air had grown colder, a damp chill that seeped through the window frames and settled deep in her bones. The task felt monumental, impossible for one person. She would have to follow the creek, journey upstream, past the edge of the village and into the woods. Alone. The thought sent a tremor of fear through her, not of the wilderness, but of being seen. If Reverend Blackwood caught wind of her prowling near the water, his insinuations would become direct accusations. Superstition, once ignited, burned hotter and faster than any logical argument. Her resolve hardened. Fear was a luxury she couldn't afford, but pragmatism was a necessity. She couldn't do this alone. The memory of Arthur Finley's intervention played in her mind. He hadn't defended her, not truly. He had defended order. He had silenced a public spectacle with the same no-nonsense efficiency he used to stack tins on his shelves. He was a man of commerce, of ledgers and facts. He dealt in the tangible, the provable. He was, she realized with a jolt of clarity, her only hope. Summoning a courage she didn't feel, Alara put on her heaviest cloak and stepped out into the biting wind. The walk to Finley's general store felt longer than ever. Each creak of a shutter, each curtain that twitched, felt like an eye watching her. The bell above the store's door chimed, a sound both welcoming and jarring. The few patrons within fell silent, their conversations dying on their lips. They stared, their expressions a mixture of fear and contempt. Arthur Finley stood behind the counter, polishing a set of scales. He looked up, his face unreadable, and gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod. "Mr. Finley," Alara said, her voice steady despite the hammering in her chest. "May I have a private word? It is a matter of some urgency." The request hung in the thick, silent air. A man near the stove grumbled something about witches having no business here. Arthur's eyes flickered toward the man, a silent warning that was instantly obeyed. He wiped his hands on his apron. "In the back," he said, his tone flat. He led her past shelves laden with flour sacks and dried beans into a small, cluttered office. A single window looked out onto a muddy back alley. The room smelled of paper, ink, and pipe tobacco. He closed the door, shutting out the hostile silence of the store. "This is highly irregular, Mrs. Vance," he began, not unkindly. "What is this about?" Alara didn't waste time with pleasantries. She pulled a folded, hand-drawn copy of her map from her pocket and spread it on his desk. "It's about the children, Mr. Finley, all of them." She pointed to the marks. "For 12 years, 79 babies have died in this village. I have a journal for every single one. I've mapped their homes." She traced the path of Hollow Creek with her finger. "The deaths are all here, in the lower village. The families on the ridge, the ones with wells, the Hathaways, the Carvers, your own family, their children live." Arthur stared at the map, his brow furrowed. He was silent for a long moment, studying the paper. He was a methodical man. She could see him processing the information, cross-referencing it with his own encyclopedic knowledge of the town. "What are you suggesting?" he asked, his voice low. "I am suggesting the cause is not a curse or a hex or God's wrath," Alara said, her voice gaining strength. "I believe it is the water. The creek is poisoned somehow. The families in the lower village drink from it, cook with it, wash with it. The families with wells do not." He leaned back, stroking his chin. He wasn't dismissing her. He was considering it. "Mrs. Gable," he said, tapping a spot on the map near the creek. "Lost too. Her husband works the lumber mill. They buy laudanum from me every few weeks for her nerves." He then pointed to a home on higher ground. "The Abbotts, 4 healthy children. They have a deep well, they buy candy and little else." He was doing it. He was seeing the pattern. The web of commerce and daily life was a map of its own, and it was aligning perfectly with hers. "It makes a terrible kind of sense," he finally murmured, looking from the map to her face. He saw not a hysterical woman, but a desperate investigator. "But observations, as you called them, won't sway anyone. Not with Blackwood preaching fire and brimstone." As if on cue, the shop door opened and closed, and the mumble of voices from the front grew louder. A man's voice, angry and righteous, carried through the thin wood. "Reverend says she was seen by the woods again, prowling like a wolf. Says the devil finds his tools in idle hands and broken hearts." Alara's blood ran cold. Arthur's jaw tightened. He looked at her, then back at the door, a flicker of anger in his eyes. The chaos he so disliked was being actively stoked by the town's spiritual leader. "He's turning them into a mob," Arthur said, his voice grim. "We don't have much time." The "we" hung in the air, a lifeline thrown across a chasm of isolation. Relief washed over Alara so powerfully her knees felt weak. "I need to find the source," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "I have to go up the creek." "Not alone, you won't," he stated, his decision made. "If you're right, we need proof, something we can show them. A dead animal, a runoff from some old tannery, something definite. He looked out the grimy window, his mind already working. The village is stirring. We must go at first light, before the gossips are awake and the reverend is at his pulpit. Meet me at the old bridge an hour before sunrise. Alara nodded, unable to speak. She carefully folded her map and tucked it away. As she walked out through the store, the patrons still watched her, but their glares felt different now. They were no longer just the weight of a village's grief, but the sharp points of an imminent, directed threat. She hurried home, the cold wind no longer feeling like a mere chill, but like the foreshadowing of the storm to come. For the first time in years, however, she was not facing it alone. The air before dawn held a brittle chill, sharp and clean in a way that felt like a lie. Alara met Arthur Finley at the edge of the woods, where the path to Hollow Creek began. He carried a lantern, its single flame a small, brave star against the oppressive dark, and a sturdy canvas sack. Alara clutched her rolled-up map, the paper stiff in the cold. They exchanged no words, only a single, weighted nod. The silence was a shared pact, a recognition of the danger and the necessity of their task. They moved along the creek's bank, their boots sinking slightly into the damp earth. The water murmured beside them, a sound Alara had once found soothing, now the soundtrack to a dozen years of grief. As they ventured further upstream, away from the sleeping village, the forest grew thicker, the ancient trees interlocking their branches overhead, swallowing the faint starlight. Arthur kept the lantern low, casting dancing shadows that played tricks on the eyes. "It was my grandfather who told me about the old tannery," Arthur said, his voice a low rumble that barely disturbed the quiet. "Shut down 30, maybe 40 years ago. He said the smell was unbearable. They just walked away from it when the owner died." Alara's breath caught. A tannery. The chemicals, lime, ash, tannins, and worse, would have seeped into the soil for decades. A slow, patient poison. It fit her theory with terrifying precision. "Where?" she whispered, her eyes scanning the dark woods ahead. "Should be another quarter mile, past that bend." They found it just as the first hint of gray light began to bleed into the eastern sky. It wasn't a building anymore, but a skeletal ruin. A few stone walls stood defiant, but the roof had long since collapsed, leaving a jumble of rotting timbers and debris. But the true horror lay behind the structure. There, half buried in the earth and tangled with weeds, were a dozen massive wooden vats, their staves warped and blackened with age. Several had split open, their contents having long ago leached into the ground. A dark, oily sheen coated the puddles near their base, and a faint, acrid smell, like bitter almonds and decay, hung in the air. Arthur held the lantern high. The light fell upon a small channel, almost invisible in the daylight, carved by runoff from the vats. It snaked through the mud and rocks, a dark tributary of poison, and emptied directly into Hollow Creek. This was it, the source. The quiet, unassuming villain that had stolen 79 lives. Alara felt a wave of cold fury, followed by a profound, hollow sadness. It wasn't a curse. It wasn't witchcraft. It was just waste. Forgotten, neglected, and deadly. She knelt, her fingers tracing the edge of the contaminated soil, careful not to touch it. It was real, tangible, irrefutable. "We have what we need," Arthur said, his voice grim. He used a piece of wood to scrape a sample of the viscous, dark soil from the runoff channel into a small glass jar he'd brought from his store. He sealed it tightly. "Let's go back. The sun is coming up and the people will be gathering." They returned to Havenwood Hollow as the church bell began to toll for Sunday service. The sun was now cresting the hills, casting long shadows across the village green. Just as Arthur predicted, families were making their way toward the church, their faces grim and pious. Reverend Blackwood stood on the steps, his black coat a stark silhouette against the white clapboard, greeting his flock with a somber authority. He saw them coming, the outcast midwife and the respected store owner, walking together, carrying a jar of black mud. A murmur rippled through the assembling crowd. Blackwood's expression hardened, his eyes narrowing with suspicion. "Mrs. Vance, Mr. Finley," the Reverend boomed, his voice carrying across the green. "An unseemly hour for a walk. I trust you are on your way to seek God's forgiveness." "We are on our way to seek truth, Reverend," Arthur countered, his voice steady and clear. He stopped before the church steps, forcing the crowd to form a semicircle around them. "And we have found it." Alara stepped forward, unrolling her map and holding it up for all to see. "For 12 years, we have buried our children," she began, her voice trembling slightly before finding its strength. "You have blamed me. Reverend Blackwood has spoken of curses and dark influences." She pointed to the map. "But the devil is not in a midwife's hands. It is in our water. Look, every family who has lost a child lives here." Her finger traced the lower part of the village, along the creek. "And every family whose children have grown strong lives here." She indicated the homes on higher ground. "They have wells. We drink from Hollow Creek," Blackwood scoffed. "Nonsense. The Lord's water is pure. This is a desperate woman's fantasy, a deception to hide her guilt." "Is it?" Arthur said, stepping forward and holding up the sealed jar. The dark, oily substance within caught the morning light. "This is what flows into our creek, not half a mile from here, from the old abandoned tannery. Poison." He handed the jar to Thomas Miller, who stood near the front, his face a mask of exhausted grief. Thomas hesitated, then took it, staring at the sludge that represented the source of his pain. "This is not an act of God," Alara said, her voice ringing with conviction. "It is an act of ignorance, of forgetting what we buried in our own backyard. We have been poisoning ourselves." The crowd was silent, the pieces clicking into place in their minds. The pattern on the map, the physical proof in the jar, the simple, horrifying logic of it all. They looked from the jar to Alara, her face earnest and raw, and then to the Reverend, his face turning purple with indignation. "Lies, heresy," Blackwood shouted, his authority crumbling. "She is a charlatan, leading you astray with parlor tricks and maps." But his words lacked their former power. The fear he had cultivated was being burned away by the harsh light of reason. It was Thomas Miller who spoke next, his voice cracking but firm as he looked at the Reverend. "No," he said, holding the jar up. "This is real. I can smell it. My farm, it's downstream. My boy," he couldn't finish. His voice choked with a new kind of grief, the grief of understanding. That was the turning point. The spell was broken. The villagers looked at each other, not with suspicion, but with a shared, dawning horror. They hadn't been cursed, they had been failed. By memory, by progress, by the simple turning of the earth. Within a week, a group of men led by Arthur and a hollow-eyed, but determined Thomas Miller made their way to the old tannery. They began the arduous work of clearing the site, of digging up the poisoned earth. Plans were made for a new, deep well to be dug on the village green, for everyone to use. Reverend Blackwood, stripped of his most potent weapon, found his sermons on sin and damnation falling on deaf ears. The village was no longer listening for a devil. They were listening for the sound of shovels striking clean earth. 6 months later, the autumn leaves were turning gold and red. Alara was called to another birth, in a small house that had once known only silence and sorrow. She delivered a healthy baby girl. This time, when she handed the child to its mother, there were no fearful glances, no whispers. There was only a weary, cautious, but genuine smile. The work of healing had only just begun. The grief of 79 lost souls would forever be a scar on the village's heart. But as Alara walked home in the crisp afternoon air, she heard the sound of the baby's cry carrying from the window, strong, loud, and full of life. It was the sound of a future she had fought for, not with prayers or superstitions, but with ink, paper, and a truth that had refused to be buried.